There's more focus on grazing management today than there ever has been in my lifetime. It all starts with the soil. It's the foundation of every terrestrial agricultural enterprise in the country. It's not just the ranchers talking about grazing management. It's billion-dollar food and beverage companies. Are there opportunities for producers? There absolutely are.
Welcome to the Future of Beef Show, produced in partnership with Drovers and Breeder. This is the #1 podcast for progressive ranchers and feeders looking to run smarter, more profitable, next-generation operations. I'm your host, Jim Johnson, from the Brands and Barbed Wire podcast, joined by Dr. Jessica Sperber, feedlot specialist at the University of Nebraska, and Ian Wheel, founder of Breeder, the cattle tech company helping producers raise, track, and trade high-performing cattle. How do we get more from the land we already have without sacrificing its future? In this episode, we sit down with Dr. Jeff Goodwin to explore the changing science and strategy of grazing and regenerative thinking in an industry that needs both productivity and resilience. Dr. Jeff Goodwin is the director of the Center for Grazing Lands and Ranch Management at Texas A&M and a leading expert in grazing systems, rangeland resilience, and regenerative practices. With over 2 decades of hands-on experience helping ranchers across diverse climates, Jeff blends science and real-world problem solving, bringing practical, research-backed insight to producers facing both ecological and economic challenges. This episode is sponsored by Corteva Agriscience. When weeds and brush get in the way, you'll find the solution at rangeandpasture.com. Jeff, welcome to the Future of Beef Show.
Honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
So why don't you give us a little background about you, how you got to Texas A&M, a little history of your career, and tell us about yourself.
So I grew up in Northeast Texas on a cow-calf operation that my grandfather managed for 30 or so years, sort of indirectly. With that operation, we lived in and around the ranch for, as I grew up, and watched him work every day, and then through a bunch of other processes, we moved off and moved around. I ended up living in California for a little while, then came back home to Texas and went to Tarleton State University, got my bachelor's and master's there. Thought about going and getting a PhD then, but I don't think my mind was ready. So went and got a job, went to work for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, worked for NRCS for 14 years, working with ranchers across Texas in multiple different locations, learning about their operations, learning how to address ecological issues within, I guess, also with an economic driven focus. And so helping to, develop conservation strategies and then using the financial tools of the Farm Bill at the time to help them implement those strategies. I did that for 14 years, ended up as the state range specialist for Texas. About 2016, I decided I wanted to do something different. So I went to Noble Research Institute and was a range and pasture consultant for them for 6 years, working Southern Great Plains, Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma. Very similar type role, but it was for a private NGO. I've always had a real focus on soils and this sort of nexus of grazing management and how we graze the land can influence not only profitability, but the ecosystem services that these grazing lands produce that benefit the urban public. And so I ended up having more questions than answers. And so I started a PhD program with Texas A&M University, Kingsville, really in this sort of soil health grazing area. Again, after about 6 years, I went to Texas A&M and had the opportunity to direct the Center for Grazing Lands and Ranch Management, and that's what I do now. I've been there for about 3 years. We focus on grazing land ecology research. All of my work is done on working ranches around the country, working directly with producers to try to help them solve their issues and provide practical and applied solutions.
Okay. Interesting. So beef cattle focused, or do you work with other species as well?
If it has a hoof on a grazing land, I'm interested in it. Most of our work's beef focused, the vast majority. Although we do work with a number of operations that are what I would consider multi-species grazing. They're in small ruminants, sheep or goats, but typically with cattle.
So Jeff, for our listeners that might not know what an ecosystem is, tell us about how that works, how it interacts with cattle and wildlife, and how you got into that with your career.
It all starts with the soil. The soil and the health and function of that soil it's the foundation of every terrestrial agricultural enterprise in the country. And so as we, historically, we've kind of looked at the soil as just this inert medium to grow crops. And that couldn't be further from the truth. It's an active living ecosystem. And so the management practices that we apply to that plant community, directly and indirectly, can impact the health and function of that soil. And so starting at that sort of soil ecosystem, building up through plant communities, providing food and forage for livestock, but also providing habitat for wildlife habitat for a $385 billion industry in this country. And so the grazing lands that we work with, there's over 770 million acres of rangelands in the United States. If you look at the states, the 19 states west of the Mississippi River, over, I think, 53% of them are rangelands. So those are native grasslands, essentially. Some grasslands, but also shrub components, and so, but native vegetation. And so a lot of cattle come from those lands, right? And so integrating strategies that not only help producers do a better job of maintaining the health and function of that plant community, but also the health of the soil, the water quality and quantity, and the provision of wildlife habitat has really been our focus in a profitable way.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about the history of grazing and why our listeners should be interested in it?
Yeah, I don't know how far you want to go back, but ruminants have been grazing this planet for a long time. We can just start, just historically in our country, before domestic livestock got here, there were still large ruminants here. 30 million head of bison roamed the plains. Flash forward, 200 years, and we still have large ruminants on the landscape, but it's a very different landscape. And so there's a lot of things that have changed. And so let me go back, say, to the mid 1980s. And so that's like 2 generations. So a gentleman named Alan Savory came to the country. And Mr. Savory had some interesting ideas about using stock density and cattle as a tool to help manage landscapes. Mr. Savory did a lot of good things, but he had a couple of things that were a struggle. He was not very quiet about telling people they weren't doing things the right way. And so, for instance, he had some really good ideas in terms of about helping landowners better implement strategies that would be more profitable and productive. And so he gets tagged with this wagon wheel grazing system concept. Short duration grazing at the time is what they called it. And so he would go in and talk to these people about producers about, he'd walk in and say, if you implement these strategies, you can double your stocking rate over time by increasing your carrying capacity if you'll just rotate and provide these rest periods. Well, what do you think is the only thing they heard in that conversation? You can double your stocking rate, right? And so people went out, developed these really elaborate wagon wheeled grazing systems and doubled their stocking rate day one, and most of them were a train wreck. And so, but if you back up and look at the conversation a little more critically, he was right. We can increase carrying capacity of these landscapes by using rest, using recovery periods, and in time, lots of operations have doubled their stocking rates, but you can't do it over time. You have to build the carrying capacity first. And that carrying capacity is the amount of forage on that landscape, right? And it changes year to year with drought, with rainfall, with a host of other impacts. But we can increase the stocking rates that we apply. That's a management decision. The stocking rate is a decision that we make as ranchers to say, this is how many cows I'm going to run. It's influenced by the amount of forage that you grow. And so balancing that is one of the key foundational components of managing a grazing system, balancing animal demand with forage supply. And so there's some techniques that we can do that we've learned, that can influence that in a very positive way and provide ecological, economic, and social benefits.
How's when you look at what's happened with grazing over that time as well, it feels like I look back to my old man and it came rotational grazing, and then it was like legumes to reduce your inputs and nitrates and things like that. And, but even then we were obviously in Australia, so we had sheep and cattle. We're still grazing it, almost down to the bone and going through, but it feels like that's progressed now to like trying to get more, roughage back into the soil, graze some, tread some in, get it off when there's still enough of root systems and the length of root systems being conversation. How's it also sort of developed from there? It feels like it didn't stop in the 80s, and there's a lot of things that have happened since then. And now we're even into micronutrients in the soil and things like that.
I think one of the things that, we've certainly still got our challenges, and I'm happy to chat about those, but we've gone from, I'll just give you a for instance, and I don't want to name names, but I sat down talking to a gentleman a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking about textbooks. And I said, there's really not a really good grazing management textbook. And he looked at me in the eye and he said, well, that's because we really haven't learned a lot in the last 30 years. And I could not disagree more. We're dealing with a bit, we still have grass, soil, and cows, but the landscape in which we manage today is very different than how we managed, say in the 40 years ago in the 80s. I can talk about some of those dynamics and those challenges, but I think to your point, I think we've learned a tremendous amount about. It's often said it's the how, not the cow, in some of these instances. And so it's not about the fact that something is being grazed. It's about how that herbivory is happening or the grazing is happening, the timing, the intensity, the frequency, and the duration, about balancing those to fit a particular context. Every ranch is its own thumbprint. It's its own signature. So the context of a ranch in Central Texas is very different from a ranch in Michigan or Nebraska. And so how you would implement those sort of 5 tenets, adding rest, and implementing those rests to meet the goal and objective of your operation is going to be different. And so we've learned a lot about how to use cattle as a tool. And what I mean by that is, instead of looking at cattle as necessarily our product, looking at the forage as our product, and the cattle as a tool to harvest that grass. And so I think we've learned a lot about, maybe more about rest and recovery than we have the grazing period, right? Grazing period's important when we start to do grazing management and planning, but the power of rest and recovery is important. And the fact that we can take a number of cattle and increase the density of those and get a number of benefits. Number one, we're getting urine and manure distribution at a higher deposition rate, more distributed across the landscape. They're utilizing forages in a more uniform manner. Now, again, it goes back to your goal and objective. If you need that sort of modeled heterogeneous look if you're managing for a specific wildlife species, then this style of grazing may not fit your context. I often say, when we talk about management, I mean, the practice and the management needs to fit the ranch and the rancher. Many times we hear about amp grazing or whatever name you want to put on it. It has to fit the ranch, the context, the ecological context of the operation. It has to fit the cattle. All right. and it also has to fit the rancher's mindset and, their time constraints, their quality of life constraints. All those things have to work, or it isn't.
We know the best in the beef industry watch this show, so we want to hear from you. We'll pick one listener to win this exclusive Future of Beef Yeti cooler. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram, send us your guest ideas, or just drop us a message. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
And then when you think about grazing in the last while, it's, you're right. The biggest complaint you'll hear from people is like, well, that won't work on my place, right? Like, I'm sure you've heard it more times than I have, is like, well, we're different here. We've got a different soil type. That doesn't work, But if you abstract that and all your teaching, like, what would you, if you're speaking to every rancher, what are the 3 principles? Because obviously, like, we're seeing benefit now from, root depth and water capture. And, when it's dry in places like Australia, that's huge. And even here, you're seeing that with just doing it. But, what would be sort of the 3 things is there anything that can apply across everyone in terms of how you think about this? Or do you have to abstract it to the level that it's not practical anymore?
There's these soil health building principles, right? Keep the ground covered, armor the soil, build organic matter. Why is that important? I mean, it's important from the perspective of resiliency, drought mitigation. We talk about soil carbon and organic matter a lot, and I like to go at it from a different angle and talk about how we can increase the resiliency of these ranches, the landscapes that we're trying to manage. And what I mean by that is, let's mitigate the opportunity that when we have a drought, we're going to have a drought, right? But let's lessen the impacts. And so how do we do that? We get more water in the ground. We increase our infiltration rates. And if we can increase the infiltration rate and have more water soak into the soil rather than run off into some creek, into some larger tributary or a lake, let's leave the soil where it is. So keep it covered, increasing that infiltration. So managing towards a lot of these sort of soil health building principles, it helps us to build organic matter. That's an overarching goal. And that organic matter not only helps soil particles hold together when it receives that rain event, it holds water longer. And so we're increasing real infiltration. We're increasing the water holding capacity of that soil. So those are the sort of cascading benefits that you start to see with following some of these soil health building strategies. And so armoring the soil is the first one, and then managing for diversity, moving away from monocultures and trying to embrace the diversity that is in the landscape. You don't find monocultures in nature, and so managing towards a diverse landscape is beneficial on a number of different levels. Minimizing disturbance as much as you can. And so, I mean, most of the time that principle gets sort of connotated, I guess, to cropland, right? Where we're moving towards a no-till system or something like that. But there's disturbances on grazing lands too. Fire is a disturbance. Grazing is a disturbance. And so we manage the timing, intensity, frequency, and duration of that grazing event to try to minimize the long-term impacts. And so those are just a handful of principles that we try to manage for, and manage for those principles before we start to implement a practice. So have those in your mind. If I implement a practice, grazing, seeding, brush management, how's it going to influence those principles at the end of the day?
So if obviously grassland management is different, like you mentioned, from the northernmost parts of this country to the southern. Like, for example, fire in Nebraska and Kansas is a thing that the sandhills and into Kansas typically use for grassland management or to improve soil. And so what would be your biggest recommendation for where a producer could go within their own region to find out what are the best practices for them on their operation? What are the resources for them?
Yeah, great question. There's a handful of regional, areas that I would go to. So for just technical assistance, the Natural Resources Conservation Service has a field office in almost every county. And so they provide technical assistance. They also have financial assistance opportunities through the Farm Bill. Your local county agent can provide you some direction. And if they don't know the answer, they typically have extension specialists in the state that can provide you direct assistance. There's a lot of NGOs or non-governmental organizations out there now providing technical assistance through public-private partnerships with the federal government. And so another one in that region, Noble Research Institute, is providing a lot of educational resources for producers that want to transition towards sort of a more regenerative direction. And so there's education out there, and honestly, everybody has a cell phone, and most of the time you can find a pretty good answer, at least get started down the right path just using the internet. I mean, there's so many resources available to us today that there weren't 20 or 30 years ago. Now, you're going to find all the answers on the internet, right? And, you might get more answers than you need, but there's sources of information out there and more people out there to help you now than ever before.
So you mentioned the word regenerative. Let's dive a little deeper into that. We know that regenerative agriculture can be used in some extreme cases. But what does that mean for sort of everyday ranchers? And tell us a little bit more about what regenerative grazing or agriculture is like.
Regenerative management or regeneration, it depending on the circle you're talking about. Some people, it's polarizing to some. The entire movement really started when we started to focus on the soil. So it was soil quality, and then it was soil health, and then that sort of transitioned into a management philosophy that was about managing. We called it regenerative management, which we were trying to regenerate the landscape, right? The ecosystem processes, and that's largely what I feel like regeneration is. It's it's implementing practices with a focus on mending broken ecosystem processes. And so there's 4 primary ecosystem processes that guide most of the function of the ranches that we're managing. Number 1 is energy flow, right? So through the process of photosynthesis, we're capturing the sun's energy. So how efficient is your ranch at capturing the sunlight, right? We have to have leaves. Those are the solar panels that capture the sun's energy, converts that into sugars, starches, carbohydrates that help the plant grow, and then in turn feed the livestock. And so there's that energy flow piece. Are we efficient at doing that? Then there's the water cycle. Are we able to capture the water that falls onto our landscape? Or are we effectively losing most of it to runoff or erosion? Third is we've got the water cycle. Then we've got the nutrient cycle. So how are we effectively cycling nutrients through the system? All of those systems, plants, soil, microbiology, they all need some level of nutrition, right? Nutrients. So are we able to cycle those, or are they stagnated in some level? You could look at manure on the landscape. If many times you go out in a paddock in some of these regenerative operations, and a pat of manure is gone in a day or two, versus you can go out to some and you see pats from last year still sitting there oxidized and white. That's a broken nutrient cycle. And then there's what we call community dynamics. So do we have the right plants? Do we have the right animals at the right place at the right time? And so regenerative management is about implementing strategies or practices to mend or regenerate a compromised ecosystem process on a ranch. And like I said, I've seen some places that are functioning very well. There's always room for improvement. I've seen a lot of ranches that have some of these issues. And in the past, we've looked at inputs. We've looked to cheap inputs in the past to help move us forward, because we see the symptoms of these broken processes. we aren't growing enough grass. We have too many weeds. We have whatever the symptom is we're trying to address. And a lot of times we've systematically looked for an input to fix that, where I think we have a shortage of management. We've got management can fix and alter and address many of these concerns, but management's not, you can't sell it, right? So, I mean, the main key there is technical assistance. It's working with these ranchers that are doing a good job, helping them tell their story, and helping people better understand what's working and why it isn't.
And is some of the challenge with the regenerative word being divisive in that, like, you've got, I've always seen it as a spectrum, right? Like there is the really, not extreme way is probably a bad way of putting it, but like the people are, religious about regenerative, but it almost feels like there's this whole spectrum in between where some people are today and where that is, that people could make baby steps towards that. Or is it, do you have to just get all in to be able to make this work?
No, this is where, and this is my opinion coming out, but I mean, people talk about regenerative practices. I don't think there is one. I think regenerative management or regeneration is about regenerating a metric, something, right? Mm. We're regenerating livelihoods, landscapes. We're trying to regenerate a system, and it's more of a philosophy about how you implement the practices, and so it's really a process. Yeah. And so the biggest change is mindset. Right? As a producer, do you have the mindset that, you want to start working towards these soil health principles, or, have an ecological mindset to say, I want to do things differently because what I've been doing really isn't working. And so, there's a lot of challenges around that word. I think it's been somewhat co-opted in a lot of different ways, but at the end of the day, it's about finding a suite of practices that fit your ecologic, economic, and social context. And if it's working, everybody wants to wear the regenerative badge, but you've got to be measuring something first, right? Follow up, measurement. And so tell me, are you actually regenerating it? And so there's a whole lot of different, topics we can talk about, whether it's carbon or production or whatever it is, but you have to be measuring some metric to tell me if you're regenerating or not.
What I just found super fascinating was when you mentioned looking at the cow pat or the manure on the pasture to make a determination of what the soil is doing. I obviously look at the manure as a way for me to know in the feedlot if that animal's actually digesting their feed stuff, or if they're healthy, the rumen's healthy, etc. Same thing out on pasture. But I never have actually thought about it from the stage of how long that manure is sitting out on the soil. And if it's still crusted over from 2 years prior and it made it through 2 winters in central Alberta, what does that say about your soil health? I don't know if you want to dive in a little bit more to that. Like, is there some type of metric that producers can actually use in determining if, and in the scenario that they do have a whole bunch of manure left over from years prior from cows that are out grazing, what would be the first step that you would suggest for them?
The reason the manure is gone is because the biology has utilized it, right? Mm-hmm. So dung beetles, for instance. Yes, microorganisms, dung beetles, they all, you just laid an energy source out there, a buffet for them to use. And so, you get on some of these regenerative type operations where they have very functional biological activity, lots of dung beetles, lots of other insects using that. It doesn't take very long and that manure pat's gone, like I said, in other instances. And so that's just a symptom, really. You'd probably have to know more about the operation to give someone a specific sort of recommendation. But I will say that most of these principles, number one, they're pretty agnostic to land use, right? So they work on cropland, they work on grassland, they work on pasture land. I think if one were to follow those principles in a way that fits their context, I think they're going to find over time that things start becoming easier. We start to increase productivity. We may reduce input costs. And you'll start to see those things like those little symptoms of manure being cycled faster. Most of the time when I see those, it's in moderately to high stocked continuous grazing operations where there isn't very much rest and recovery, or the cow pies are often taller than the grass.
Well, what I like about that is like that's nutrients that's now being used by the soil if it breaks down, and otherwise you're going to be paying for fertilizer to make it up.
Correct.
Right? And so, yeah, that's free.
Yep.
You know, why wouldn't you want to make the most of it? So,
yeah, 85% of what goes in a cow is in a grazing system is coming out the back end. And so that's one of the reasons that we want to, use stock density as a tool. And I'm not saying use ultra high stock density all the time. It's about being adaptive.
Ever wondered if you could be getting more out of your cattle?
Breeder is the first technology company that's able to track and optimize cattle from conception all the way to the rail.
This puts the power of data into the hands of the rancher and enables them to improve their profit line quicker than they ever have before.
My decision to partner with Breeder was made largely after seeing a demo where I realized what Breeder's doing is unlike anyone else in our industry. Connecting the data from the packing plant back to the feedlot, the stocker backgrounders, and the cow-calf, even connecting that data to the purebred breeder, will just open the door to improvement at a scale and a speed that we have never seen in this industry before.
I believe Breeder's putting ranchers in the driver's seat. We can make breeding decisions based on large amounts of data very quickly. The calves that are produced, they have a higher cutout value. Their ribeyes are more profitable, and it plays back to us.
As I'm out around the country, people are asking me about Breeder, and I always recommend Breeder. It's the tool for the future.
Head to breeder.co and book a demo with the team today.
That's another key component about mending some of these processes is we can't be prescriptive about it. There's no one set recipe that's going to fix all the problems. So being adaptive and changing up the strategies around how we graze these properties, or even down to the paddock level, the timing, when you would graze those, the intensity, using stock density as a tool to change it up. There might be times where, and this is a pretty consistent grazing technique, is that we want to move fast when the plants are growing fast, right? So in the spring, we're going to try to move as fast as we can and chase the green, if you will. Well, when the plants start slowing down, then we slow down, right? And so our recovery periods maybe become longer, but our grazing periods will become a little, we'll start to slow everything down. Maybe make our paddocks a little bit bigger, slow our rotations down, and maybe get a little more impact on some of those acres during the dormant season. So but all of those strategies, none of them are going to work the same way every time, everywhere. So you got to make it adaptively fit your context.
So we've talked about regenerative agriculture and the ecosystem, but how does all that work together to affect profitability? So speak to maybe our listeners and that are curious about whether they want to increase inputs, and some of us think that regeneration and working on the ecosystem increases inputs, but maybe talk to them about that, how that increases profitability.
There's a couple of different ways to increase profitability, right? I think one of the easiest ways is to start reducing input costs. And so if we can implement strategies to look at the number one, we need to know where our costs are. I can tell you a lot of the ranchers that we work with don't know where money's going, right? That they know the bills they're paying, but many of them don't know their unit cost of production. What is their cost of carrying a cow for a year? And so those that do are really good at sort of managing those finances. But the average producer looks at weaning weight. They look at how many calves they sold, and they're not capturing their time, their labor. And so when you stand back and look at all of it, you look at the cost to carry a cow, 60% to carry of the cost to carry that cow for the most part, winter feeding costs. And so what strategies can we implement to limit the biggest piece of that unit cost of production? And so grazing management can play a key role of that. When I say winter feeding costs, it's feeding hay, right? And so in our area, there's a lot of people that are feeding hay 4 and 5 months out of the year when we have a really long growing season. But some of these more, I say, adaptive producers that are more conservatively stocked, but are using many of these grazing strategies, they haven't fed a bale of hay in 10 years. And so their input costs have significantly decreased, and it increases their profitability. They're also focused on beef produced per acre rather than beef produced per head. So they're less interested in increasing the weaning weights of their calves, and more interested in producing as much beef per acre as they can. And so that's running, smaller framed cows and more of them, more moderate framed cows than focus on those that are producing the highest weaning weights. It's just a different paradigm.
So Jeff, it's a question that I was wanting to lead into. As we see these cows get bigger and bigger and require more and more inputs, how do you have that conversation with your producers about these cows are getting bigger, and so they're going to require more inputs, so we have to manage our grazing systems to be able to increase those inputs?
Yeah, I mean, you go out on a place and
I think just define geography right now, right? Because a big cow in the north is a good thing if she's standing in snow for 4 months of the year, right? So I think it's important to define geography for this part of the discussion.
Yeah,
So,
and I'm talking about the Southern Great Plains.
Yes.
Right? And so, I mean, for us, and there's some big cows here too. And you ask a guy that's been on a place for 3 or 4 generations, and my grandpa ran 200 cows. Well, why can't I do that now? Well, his 4 generations ago, his cows probably weren't 1,400 pounds. Maybe they were 1,000-pound cow. We have significantly more brush than we had now. So grazable acres are decreased in much of the Southern Great Plains. We've had expanses of mesquite and cedar, especially up into the southern into Kansas and Oklahoma, where eastern red cedar has increased. And so it's a combination of things. It's not just one thing. We have less grazable acres. Our cows are bigger. Input costs are higher, and even though the cattle market is really good right now, it hasn't kept in track with the cost of inputs. And so producers looking for a different way have tried to figure out ways to limit those inputs as much. And so, you just have to sit down and put a pencil to it. And if in many cases, when we work with folks, I mean, you can run less cows and be more profitable. Or we increase, maybe that's just for a period of time where we increase that carrying capacity. And before too long, they're running more cows than they were before on the same acres of land. And so I think that's a way that we're going to have to move forward if we want to be, if we want to grow. We're not making any more land, so we're going to have to be more efficient with what we have.
And that is one of the fears that you hear from people. It's like, well, if I went to regenerative practices and I've stopped tillage and I'm stopped turning the soil, I'm going to have 2 years where I'm going to be way worse off. And, how do you get people over that fear? It's probably fear and reality in some cases for people, because you've really got to have a long-term view. And if you've got to pay bills next year, the thought of being smaller next year and not being as big, how do you get people to deal with that hump that you got to get over?
It's an interesting point, because you hear a lot of stories of the folks that have been very successful in sort of moving in that direction. And they started out with, we were about to lose the farm, right? Yeah. Even Gabe Brown tells that story, and it was this big drastic event that changed their life. I think there's more and more people not getting to that point and making a transition now.
Luckily.
Let's hope they don't have to almost lose the farm to change the direction. But when most people come to us, something isn't working, and so they're often looking for they're either looking for a different way to do things, or they've already tried something different and they want validation. And they want us to come and say, am I doing this right? What do you think? What's a better way to do this? And so, we'll evaluate the situation and make some recommendations. It's a gradient, right? Just like with grazing management, it's a spectrum. It's a gradient. There's producers that watched one YouTube video and they're ready to change the world. And then there's others that are certain, super, super pragmatic and will never change. But there's this big bell curve in the middle of producers that are really interested. Sometimes they're on the fence, they're leaning one way or the other. And so how do you make an impact with those folks? Start small. Even if there's an opportunity. A lot of people will say, well, I don't want to make my pasture look like that because then my neighbor will see it. Well, do it in the back pasture, right? Go back in the back where no one can see it and start small and just try and test and investigate yourself, because I think a lot of people would like to try things differently, but it's a real risk, especially if you've got hundreds of thousands of dollars tied up into equipment on the farming side for sure. On the ranching side, I think we can transition pretty easy. The limitation on the watering side, on the ranching side, is water. From in my experience, it's not being having enough distribution of water. We might have a pretty large pastures and we got one water trough in the corner, so that limits your opportunity to increase distribution. So looking at water development strategies, how can I find help to get more water distributed, or just better, how can I better utilize that pasture? Water's a big one. Fencing is another.
I was going to ask you that. Dr. Mary Jernowski, who I'm sure you know, at University of Nebraska, just finished up a virtual fencing study and looking at yearlings out grazing. But how do you think technologies in that area, virtual fencing, et cetera, will be able to help the charge for producers to, enhance their grasslands?
Yeah, and I'll add to that, because I'm an NRCS guy. We've put fence up, we rotate pastures and do all that, but man, I completely underestimated the amount of maintenance now I have to do on those fences.
Yeah, and
so that's something I wasn't planning on or wasn't prepared for. Probably is just the maintenance I have to do on fences now. And so, can technologies like that help with rotations and fence maintenance and some things like that as well?
I'll say they absolutely can if your mindset will allow it. We look at technologies like virtual fencing. I think the sky's the limit for that sort of opportunity. Number one, materials are expensive, labor's expensive to build new. I'm talking about permanent fences. Now, the alternative is using temporary fencing, which a lot of regenerative folks use. These paddocks are not hard to build, but the stigma there is, well, that's too much time. I have to be there every day, and I don't want to go move cows every day, and so that's a social constraint. And so is there an opportunity for virtual fencing? 100%. The more I see opportunities like that, now the water's still a limiter, but there's a lot of good companies out there doing some great work. There's eShepherd and Vince, and there've been struggles with the battery in the past. I think they're getting a whole lot better on the technology side in terms of battery length. There's still challenges. Halter has come out with an interesting collar that's solar powered that doesn't have some of the battery issues, and so I think there's absolutely opportunity for utilizing that tool in today's world.
There's nothing greater than seeing your cattle grazing on lush green pasture. Oh yeah, and nothing ruins that view like weeds and brush soaking up all the moisture and nutrients. Regardless of precipitation, we have to take care of our pastures. It doesn't rain grass.
The passion for cattle ranching starts early. So should the protection. Let's keep our pastures in good hands with Corteva Agriscience. To learn more, visit rangeandpasture.com.
I just want to talk a little bit high level about technology, though, because it seems like we often go to the technological solution. Technology is never going to replace ecology, and so I think technology is there to help us understand ecology and help us understand how to influence a particular ecology, and whether we're talking about in Canada or in South Texas, it can help us better manage that ecological situation. But man, we're often looking for a technology solution when sometimes our solution is just better management. But if that technology can help us better manage that system.
So you're telling me there's no silver bullets?
There never has been. Never has been.
So where do you see, outside of that, or where do you see grazing going in the future? Do you think we'll get more into the regenerative grazing systems?
I don't think that movement is ever slowing down.
Yeah.
I think I think we're absolutely moving forward. The thing I like about the current times is there's more focus on grazing management today than there ever has been in my lifetime. Why? Because people now care about the ecosystem services that grazing can benefit. And so it's not just the ranchers talking about grazing management. It's billion-dollar food and beverage companies talking about the benefits of grazing management. It's organizations like the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef and Trust in Food and Trust in Beef, all these organizations looking at grazing management because it's the primary management practice that we put on a grassland landscape. It's grazing, right? And so going back to it's the how, not the cow. It's about managing, expectations around grazing management. We're starting to learn that we can graze in certain, implement a suite of management practices around grazing management that can benefit soil carbon, that can increase soil carbon sequestration, that can increase water quality and quantity, that can provide these benefits to wildlife habitat that benefit the urban voter. And most people don't understand that. But back to the food and beverage companies. They all signed up for some sort of climate target to reduce their footprints. Well, when you look at many of these organizations, a lot of them, look, you track that supply chain, it goes right down to the cow-calf producer. And so, especially in the, several of those, within the beef supply chain. And so are there opportunities for producers? There absolutely are. And science is trying to catch up to some of them. There's still challenges around quantifying soil carbon, and modeling is getting better. Our sampling strategies are getting better, but that 2030 timeframe's coming quick.
Well, and the biggest challenge is cows out grazing. We truly don't know their dry matter intake.
Yeah.
So when we talk about improving efficiency of those animals from a genetic standpoint, cattle out grazing are the ones that are the most difficult to understand.
Agreed. That's the golden question. Right?
Yeah, we could figure that out.
Yeah. Well, that feels like something that we've been doing, like genetics and everything you put on grass. It's great that you're getting grass, but then you look at the nutrient density of that grass, what nutrients are in that grass, and like that link between the actual genetics and growth and welfare to the grass feels like that next area. Like we've got one system, which is the grass system. We've got another system, which is the cattle system, but neither shall one shall speak at the moment. It's like, which is not that extreme, but it does feel like there's a bigger system thinking of the biology of that cow with the grass and what's in the grass that's going next.
I think we have to think about it that way because that's what it is. It's a big, massive system. And if we don't think about things in a systematic way from a systems viewpoint, then we start to try to compartmentalize. And I think that's what we've done wrong for the longest time. Even in the scientific communities, we've had this reductionist sort of viewpoint that we have to control all of these variables in a controlled, replicated trial. Well, try controlling for all of these variables in nature. Yeah. It just doesn't happen. So we have to, many times reevaluate how we do the science to answer some of these questions.
Yeah. And just to go back to the carbon thing, I mean, it's been a controversial topic in the industry for the last 3 to 4 months. And, how important is it, to be, you're part of US Roundtable, like how important is it for us to engage with these brands? Because, we said they're not slowing down. They might be quieter about it, but they're not slowing down in terms of hitting the goals that you talked about. And so, how important is for producers to feel like they should be engaging with some of these people on the other side of the table?
Well, the old adage is if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, right? And so I think it's important for us to be part of that conversation. And I say us, my family's, cow-calf operators and us, even as an academic community, we need to be at that table, helping to better understand, the future direction. And so, I think there's certainly opportunity. Again, we talk about supply chain issues, and most of my primary focus has been kind of in that cow-calf sector, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we become more efficient? How do we produce those ecosystem processes? But quantifying those are, that's the sort of golden ticket that most of these companies are interested in, and so they're interested in sort of offsetting their carbon footprint. And if there's ways to, that's why with the roundtable, we've really focused on grazing management plans, because it's really the first step towards better grazing management. There's an Eisenhower quote that says, the plans are useless, but planning is indispensable, right? And so it's that planning process that you go through in it's not necessarily the piece of paper, but it's that planning process of thinking through all of the alternatives, making the decision, having the follow-up, the evaluation, being adaptive. Those are the key things that are going to make you successful in the long term. But if we can start developing more grazing management planning, then people are thinking about grazing management, and they'll make better decisions in the future. And ultimately, those cascading benefits will increase the provision of ecosystem services.
Isn't the danger with some of the carbon, though, that we focus as producers on, we'll get them to pay me a carbon credit because they've got a big, logo that everyone knows. And actually, the benefits to this that you've talked about so far through the whole episode is actually more for production, just changing your own efficiency on the ranch.
I don't even like to talk about carbon from that perspective, just because when I refer to good management, I mean like managing for benefiting the ecosystem and the ecosystem of the production system, right? So we've got to be profitable for this thing to work, and so carbon and these ecosystem services are all riders to good management. And so if we can help producers be more efficient with their production enterprise, and oh, by the way, we might sequester some carbon along the way. We might increase the organic matter of the soil, which is 58% carbon. And so if we can start thinking about building healthy soils again and growing more diverse, productive ranging grazing lands, carbon's going to take care of itself. And so is the water quality and quantity and the wildlife habitat. And so I agree. Yes, 100%. The producer should think about how this is going to impact their own production system. And if there's a way to leverage that to be compensated by someone that's interested in my own outcomes that are already being implemented, then let's talk about it.
Dr. Goodwin, any closing thoughts or comments for producers that might be viewing the show today?
I call myself an idealistic pragmatist, right? I think there's all these great ideas, but then I want them to be practical, and when I think about the grazing industry, I just hope that folks will start to look for the practical side of application instead of being divisive about words. Let's think about what is going to help my operation, and then be adaptable, because we've spent a lot of time working with a number of producers, and by far the trait that I see the most common in most operations that are successful is they're adaptive. They adapt to markets, they adapt to weather, they have cattle that can adapt to the conditions that they're operating under, and so find ways to be as adaptive as possible. That's the key trait that I've seen provide the most success to the most producers.
So, Jeff, thanks for being on the show today. We appreciate all your great insights and expertise in the field of grazing.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Stay tuned. It's time for Ian, Jess, and I to go behind the beef. All right, so that's the first grazing guest we've had on the episode or on the show so far. So, what'd you guys think?
Excellent. I think it obviously gives a different perspective, right? Being from on the feedlot side of things, it's good to always remember back to the grasslands are what we need to initially get that calf. So it's it's good to think of, but also I think a good reminder for producers that there's a lot of other ways to manage their operations and manage their grazing, and just starting out and planning is the most critical thing that you can do to try and enhance your yields and enhance the pounds weaned, etc.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear the history of sort of grazing management and how it all kind of transitioned into today, I guess, in the different ways that people managing and graze their ecosystems.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like, having grown up with my dad, thought a lot about that, and like he started growing alfalfa and legumes to get nitrogen in, so less inputs, and rotational grazing with sheep for worms and a bunch of other reasons for doing it. But then you think about what even he was doing there now to like where it's moved, and we know regenerative can sometimes have bad connotations, but you listen to like the ethos of what we're trying to do there in terms of less inputs, better soil. The cowpat one was a really, really just interesting, practical way of thinking about that's nutrient into the soil. So the adaptive thinking, last point from Jeff, is like, how do we always, comes back to what we always talk about here, like that learning mindset and the innovative mindset to be able to try things different. And yeah, look, it'll be interesting. There's a few controversial things in there as well, which I think for some people, I sometimes wonder why it's controversial, but it can be very controversial as well when you get to those topics.
Yeah, I think that's right. It is interesting. I think when we start thinking outside the box on some things, and technology versus ecology, I think was one of his comments. But I think you wonder why it does get controversial. We're really trying to do the best for the cattle and the land, and then the wildlife and everything that has to also function in those environments. And so I think as beef producers, we all want to do that. We all want to make it better for everybody involved if it's at all possible, and become more profitable while we're doing it, right?
Well, and the techie point's an interesting one. Like, as a techie who loves the beef industry, I would agree. Like, it's a tool to support good management. It's not a solution, right? Like, but it can be an amazing tool if you've got that mindset shift. So I think that was a really good point. Like, I think sometimes the technology guys come in and tell you they'll solve all their problems, but if you're not ready to change as a management perspective, you're never going to be able to drive it. It's, whether it's from dairy to beef to cropping, like, it's still the mindset first.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting thing was we talked about different environments, right, and different areas of the country and all that stuff. But it's going to benefit us no matter what what environment we're in. And I think that's kind of the important thing to kind of take from it, is it's beneficial no matter whether you're in Canada or South Texas or Virginia.
One thing that I didn't mention during the episode, but now that just sparked my train of thought now, is I don't think it's ever too late. And I wish we would have got into that in a little bit more in detail in the episode. Like, for example, there's a ranching family in Canada that literally regenerated an old gravel pit. So it was a gravel pit that had been used for years and years, and they regenerated the land to now have grazing cattle on it. It took, I think, like 5 to 10 years over that time, but they hedged away at it little by little. And so that's a positive thing for us as a country, and as on a global aspect, is if we chip away little by little, we can get the land to be productive again in a time when maybe it's not anymore.
Yeah, we see it in strip mining areas and stuff back in my part of the country too, where
But I think that was the first time I'd heard it articulated, that mindset of like, how do you get the most energy transfer, the most nutrient transfer, and then the water system that goes with it. And, you know, and then there was a fourth one, which I think was more about sort of the system you put around that and your cattle and how you make that work. But, you know, just to be able to articulate, that does work for everyone. You know, I'll speak to my brother and he's like, yeah, but I've got 6 soil types in that paddock pasture. And you're like, it won't work there. And you're like, well, actually, those same principles could work across all of that. And, you know, that was really interesting.
Well, and I think it was good that he said each one's a little different. It seems like a lot of times in the cattle business, we'll have somebody come out and say, this is the way you have to do it, and it's this way, or you know, you're not doing it right. And so we see that so often. And it's nice to know that you can start small, you can start here, but just get started. You don't have to be the complete regenerative person that's out there, you know, running chickens behind hogs, behind cattle, or whatever that is. And you can just start here and still.
But isn't that why we love ranchers? Because we're all fiercely independent. We've got to have our own little idea that goes on top of what everyone else has done. Like, you know, let's celebrate the fact we're all different, but take some of the principles and have some innovation on our own property to make it work.
Yep.
So
start with moving the hot wire every 5 days, not every day, right? On strip grazing.
Yeah.
Lots of different opportunities.
Yeah. No, it was great. It was good to talk about. I mean, we were all talking about feed and genetics and all of that all the time. So it was great to talk about grass.
And I kept wanting to go back to genetics and
Yeah, I know you did.
No, it's very good. No, it was great to have him in.
That's it for this episode of the Future of Beef Show. And a big thank you to our guest for joining us and sharing their experience and insights on this topic. Hit the subscribe button for more great episodes like this one. If you want to dig deeper into what you heard today, head over to futureofbeef.com, where you'll find free resources and helpful links. Don't forget, we'll pick one listener to win this exclusive Future of Beef Yeti Cooler. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram and drop us a message for a chance to win. Until next time, keep your boots on the ground and your eyes on the future.